And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather looking like this, with a big low pressure area out over the Bering Sea, moving north-northeastward, pushing a front into the western interior, with rain spreading in toward the central part of the state tonight, especially up along this warm front there across the Brooks Range into the Yukon Flats, staying dry farther to the east down into Prince William Sound, dry for the Panhandle with light winds. Gusty west-southwest winds blowing around the bottom of this feature, with numerous showers becoming kind of scattered and isolated down toward the Aleutians, but staying wet over the southwest interior, with rain sliding into Kodiak Island. For tomorrow, that front right on the east side of Kodiak by mid-afternoon tomorrow or so, and up Cook Inlet into the Susitna Valley, central interior. Rain from the front back to the west there, especially up over the northern Bering Sea, with that low tracking right up into the strait. And areas of rain, western Arctic coast, kind of getting hung up on the Brooks Range there, so it'll be drier over the central and eastern North Slope and Arctic coast. Sunny and on the hot side here over the eastern interior, with over toward the border looking at highs mid to upper 80s, well into the 70s in Copper River Basin. But cooler here with the rain and clouds, south central Alaska, and showers along the coast and the northeast Bering Sea, but not too bad. A fair amount of clearing going on out over the Bering along the Aleutians there. Dry conditions, much lighter winds. And for the southeast coast, partly to mostly sunny. A few clouds out along the outer coastline lingering through the day. And then big change comes in, especially for cooler temperatures here, with showers and clouds into the southeast coast. The weak trough bringing that condition in, and also much cooler, maybe 20 degrees cooler over toward the eastern border there on Monday, with highs struggling to reach 70, and cooler in the Copper River Basin. Numerous showers, cloudy, cool conditions in the central interior, improving back out toward the west coast. Partly to mostly sunny, Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet down to Kodiak Island. Bristol Bay, not too bad. Dry for the Aleutians. Next storm coming in with possible storm force winds into the western Aleutians there. Not quite reaching Adak and Atka until Monday night. For the coastal water forecast, along the southeast coast, northwest winds tomorrow. 15 knots here on the central and south coast. North coast looking at west winds at 10. North winds 10 knots. Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait northwest at 10. And then south winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait. Prince of Wales Island out along the coastline there, south at 10. Central coast westerlies 10 to 15 knots, and the north coast light winds at about 10 knots from the west and southwest. Lynn Canal, south winds 15 knots, but seas staying around 2 feet. Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, variable winds 10 or 10 to 15 knots for the day tomorrow, but gale force southwest winds, southern Cook Inlet, southwest 35 knots. There are seas up to 12 feet. Northern Cook Inlet, south winds 30 knots with 10-foot seas. Good gales in Kamishak Bay, southeast at 40 knots with 12-foot seas. Barren Island, southeast winds 30 knots, seas 8 feet. And for the day on Monday, westerlies at 35 knots for Kamishak Bay with 11-foot seas, west 30 knots for the Barren Islands, and west winds 30 knots for southern Cook Inlet with 9-foot seas, winds coming down to 20 knots from the southwest with seas subsiding to 4 feet for northern Cook Inlet. Prince William Sound, light northwest breeze at 10 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. West at 25, seas 7 feet for the western North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, south winds 30 knots, seas 10 feet for the day Sunday. Southwest winds 25 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay, with seas running anywhere from 8 to 12 feet. And for the day on Monday, lighter winds here for the peninsula, a little more variable here, especially on the south side of the peninsula there at about 15 knots. Otherwise, south to west winds at 15 to 20 knots for the Bering Sea side. Small craft advisories for Bristol Bay. West at 25, seas 8 feet. Kodiak Island, west winds 20 to 25 knots, 5 to 6 foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds tomorrow at 30 knots with 12 to 15 foot seas. West winds 25 knots for Adak and Atka with 14 foot seas. And the western Aleutians, west to southwest winds at 15 to 20 knots. And for Monday, next storm coming in, Look for storm force winds associated with that. Southeast or south to southeast, 45 to 50 knots from Adak westward to Shemya, or I should say west of Adak to Shemya. Gale warnings developing for the central Aleutian, southeast increasing to 35 knots, and for the eastern Aleutian, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, gale warnings. Yukon Delta coast south at 35 knots, Kuskokwim Delta coast south at 40 knots. Southeast 25, St. Lawrence Island, small craft advisories, Norton Sound. South winds there at 30 knots with 6-foot seas. Westerlies at 35 knots for the Pribilofs, and northwest gales for St. Matthew Island at 35 knots with seas in all those areas at about 13 feet. And for Monday, gale force southerlies 35 knots, St. Matthew Island seas at 8 feet. Southwest 25 for St. Paul and St. George, seas at 10 feet. Southwest 25 here for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, Yukon Delta coast to St. Lawrence Island, westerlies at 20 knots, and still looking at small craft advisories for Norton Sound with those west winds at 25 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 20 to 25 knots, central coast northeast at 25 knots, with small craft advisories here for the central and western Arctic coast, again northeast 25 to 30 knots, 6-foot seas. Chukchi Sea, though, south winds at 15 to 20 knots. And then for the day on Monday, Chukchi Sea looking at the gale force winds out of the west and northwest at 35 knots. Western Arctic coast, northwest 20 to 25 knots. Central coast, northwest at 15. And the eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at southwest winds at 20 knots with seas of 4 feet.